Hello guys, welcome back. My name is Nathan, and today I'm going to be making my post-World Juniors 2021 NHL mock draft. Now the U18 World Juniors are officially over, and there's been a lot of players rising and falling in my rankings, but who are these specific players who have risen and fallen? Who do I see as the best prospects in this draft class, and which of the top prospects make today's top 25? Watch till the end for the entire rankings and the entire mock draft, and hit that subscribe button if you're new. 60% of the people watching the videos are not subscribed, so every bit helps, and subscribe for more almost daily hockey and prospect content just like this. Now we are officially going to start today's mock draft at number 20. I'll have 21 through 25 on this side of the screen as we go through it, but we're going to start the analysis at number 20 and the 20th best prospect of the 2021 NHL draft. We're going to start today with an absolute surprise this year, a guy that's been absolutely on fire, and besides Jesper, Wallstedt is absolutely one of the best goalies in this class. Going to number 20, I next up have Sebastian Cossa of the Edmonton Oil Kings. Now, Bob McKenzie had him 14 in his last mock draft about a month ago, and that really put me on his radar, and he had an absolutely amazing start of the season and really just continued that momentum. He would finish with a 17-1-1 record in the WHL, but he's 6'6", has amazing size to him too, and I think he's a guy that among Canadian goaltenders recently could be one of the best we've seen in a very long time. But now we're going to end up moving on to the 19th spot in the list, and the 19th best prospect in the 2021 NHL draft, featured a lot in the U18s and really just having a good season overall. We're going to move on to Russian captain Nikita Chibrikov. Now, Nikita Chibrikov is an interesting one. 13 points in 7 games played. Point-wise, did very good point-wise in the U18s, and I think a lot of that was because of the big games he played. When he was on his game, he was absolutely amazing. It was a humongous part of that Russia team, but there were other times where the consistency wasn't quite there, and there would be periods where he kind of seemed a little bit more like a rover rather than the actual impact captain that he had played like in the past. I mean, Nikita Chibrikov was absolutely still solid in the U18s, though, and mostly carried on that skill and finesse game that we've seen in the MHL so far this year. But now we're going to move on to number 18 and move on to Swedish winger as well in Oskar Olausson. Now, Oskar Olausson unfortunately was too old to play in the U18s this year, but I think overall had a pretty successful season playing as much as he did. He was in the U20s for Team Sweden, was in the Allsvenskan, the SHL, the Junior 20, played in the regulation games for HV71. There was a lot of games under his belt in a lot of different leagues, and I think that does affect a young player, but overall, I think he was still very, very good. He played a really solid, really skilled game in the SHL, and in the Allsvenskan, he was over a point, half a point per game, which for a player that young, I still think is pretty impressive, and his Junior 20 level production was amazing too. He is a very solid prospect though, and when it comes to crafty and overall speed and skill, he has a lot of that to his game, and I think he could become a really solid, productive middle six player in the future. But now we're going to end up moving on to number 17, and the 17th best prospect in the 2021 NHL draft. My pick is going to go to a guy that I don't think has played bad necessarily to be dropped at this spot. It's more so been a lot of players that I think have taken his place in terms of stock and have actually looked a lot more consistently impressive. We're now going to move on to number 17 though and go on to Finnish centerman Aatu. Now, Aatu is a guy that I still think can become a really solid, really interesting NHL product. A guy that I don't see becoming a first-line center, but I think has potential to be a decent second line, but maybe even an amazing third-line defensive shutdown guy. The problem is just translating that offense, because in a lot of ways he's been unlucky this year, and the play driving has been solid, and the results there in terms of puck possession have been pretty good, but the overall offensive creativity I think has just stalled since he was 16 or 17 years old. But now we're going to move on to number 16 and go on to another European center. This one I think having a lot more potential in a lot of areas in Fyodor Svechkov. Now, Fyodor Svechkov also had a great World Juniors like Nikita Chibrikov, and I think Svechkov was as good as advertised. I think especially as the tournament wore on, he was a little bit more efficient, a little bit more productive, but I think in terms of raw potential, he's still an amazingly smart center, a guy that positionally is fantastic, among the best forwards in this draft. And I think when it comes to high IQ, high simple plays, when it comes to Fyodor Svechkov, he makes a lot of them efficiently, and I think he will do that as well at the NHL level. But now we're going to get inside the top 15 for today's mock draft, and coming in at the 15th spot, we're going to go to a guy that had a huge impact, I thought, in the U18 for Team Canada, and watching almost every single game, or as much as I possibly could, he definitely stood out as one of the biggest risers of the U18 World Juniors. We're now going to to move on to number 15 and go on to Mason McTavish. Now, Mason McTavish is an interesting product to me. Was sent over to the Swiss League because the OHL isn't playing this year and looked really good against pros, especially in the overall game, which you could tell made some major strides from last year in the OHL. But this year in the World Juniors as well, he had some big strides too, and you can see the overall consistency getting a lot better when it came to McTavish. But McTavish just has a lot of overall good underlying skills that I think will translate well to the NHL level. But now we're going to go on to number 14 next up and go on to one of my favorites in this draft class that continued to be amazing in the WHL and the World Juniors. We're now going to move on to Team Canada forward Logan Stankoven. Logan Stankoven is absolutely one of my favorites, 5'8", but he's an absolute madman out there. If you said he was like 6 foot, I would have kind of believed you because he plays that high intensity, high grit game that I think is super hard to play against, whether he is 5'8" or not. He's efficient, he's effective, and he's a player that nobody wants to see out there on the ice. But his skill is also amazing. I love his overall offensive creativity. His playmaking is exceptional, and I think he's a guy that definitely among the top 20 class in this draft certainly gets very underrated. But next up, we're going to go to number 13 and the 13th best prospect of this 2021 NHL draft class. I'm going to now move on to another one of my favorites and another Team Canada forward. Well, not Team Canada, but Canadian forward, and Xavier Bourgault. Now, Bourgault is an interesting one to me because he has a lot of translatable skills that I think will definitely work out well. Through a decent chunk of the season, he was without first-rounder Dallas Stars-wise Maverick Bourque, and actually didn't just survive, but thrive. And I thought that was a big reason why he should be higher on a lot of lists, and he comes in at number 13 to me. But his overall creativity when he just gets a little bit of space is absolutely amazing. But next up, we're going to move on to number 12, and continuing the trend of high-scoring forwards, we're now going to move on to USA Sniper at number 12 in Chaz Lucius. Chaz Lucius has definitely made a name for himself once again this year after coming off from a bad injury. He has been stupendous in the USDP level and has been one of the best players on that team consistently when he has played. Unfortunately, due to circumstances, he was not able to play in the U18 World Juniors for Team USA, but if he did, I thought he would have had a humongous impact and probably would have been the best player on that USA team. He's a guy, though, that in terms of the raw overall talent, the raw overall goal scoring, if it all turns out right in terms when it comes to skating, could be the best goal scorer of this draft potentially when it comes to the pure underlying skill. Next up, though, at number 11, we're going to go to another great offensive dynamo and another Canadian forward. Next up in Cole Sillinger. Now, Cole Sillinger has played a lot of center, played a lot of wing. I think most likely he will be a winger at the NHL level, but I think there's a lot to like when it comes to his offensive game. To me, I love his skating. I love his overall quickness, and he's able to get good defenders off guard so incredibly efficiently too. I think when it comes to Sillinger, though, the playmaking is awesome. He's always deceptive, always trying to make something new happen, and I think that's definitely a good trait of him. I think he's another guy that will be a top 6 player if all develops right, and could be one of the most entertaining players of this draft. But now officially getting us started inside the top 10 for today's 2021 NHL mock draft, and getting us started at number 10, I'm now going to move on to Swedish defender Simon Edvinsson. Now, Edvinsson is one of those guys I've talked about a ton on this channel in terms of having that boom or bust potential. A lot of people have compared him to a guy like Philip Broberg, and in some ways I do agree. But Edvinsson's overall puck handling, his overall skating has so much potential. He could become one of the best prospects of this draft, or could become one of the biggest busts. In terms of the defensive awareness, though, especially in the neutral zone, there's just some baffling decisions that I think he makes, but you can see it throughout the World Juniors, those flashes of great play, and especially in that last game versus Canada, actually had a really solid game for himself. If Edvinsson continues that type of play, I think he can become a really good player, and I still think it's worth taking a bet like that inside the top 15, and potentially even the top 10. But coming in at number 9, another Swedish player at the 9th spot, and a guy that I think rightfully still deserves to be inside the top 10. We're going to move on to the best goaltender of this class, and even though Sebastian Cossa is making it interesting, I think will be the highest goaltender picked in this draft class as well. We're going to move on to the Swedish goalie himself, Jesper Wallstedt. Now, Jesper Wallstedt had the greatest SHL playoffs, and the consistency in the third half of the SHL season wasn't amazing. But I think Jesper Wallstedt's potential and overall skill is so amazing that inside the top 10, you still need to make a bet like that. If a team needs a goaltender, Jesper Wallstedt's one of the best bets you could have made in the past decade. He is that good. But now going inside the top 8, and coming in at number 8, I'm now going to move on to a guy that's also risen a little bit in Dylan Guenther. Now, Dylan Guenther started the WHL season absolutely amazingly and was able to play in the U18 World Juniors for Team Canada. In some ways, I thought it looked a little bit more average than he should have, and I think the U18s didn't really raise his stock too much, but the WHL play, I think, absolutely has. And if we're going by that WHL play, which is a much bigger sample size, he's been one of the best players on his team, one of the most consistent play driving-wise as well, and I think he will still become a top 6 player, and still has potential to be a first liner too. But now getting us at number 7, and the 7th best prospect of the 2021 NHL draft class, I'm now going to move on to a guy that, just in terms of the fun factor, is one of the most entertaining prospects of this draft. We're going to move on to another Canadian forward and move on to Kent Johnson. Now, you can have Kent Johnson a lot higher, and I can see why. His highlights look amazing. His overall skill is going to be great at the NHL level, but I think there will be a little bit of an adjustment made for Kent Johnson going from the NCAA to the pro game. There's a lot that he gets away with, especially defensively and in the defensive zone, that I think will not really translate to the pro level, especially in the NHL eventually. But the raw skill is amazing. His puck handling is awesome, and he could become one of the best playmakers and offensive forces of this draft. But now going on to number 6, and a guy that has floated around a lot for me, I would say, but I still think he's in a pretty great position to potentially go pretty high in this draft. Had a great World Juniors as well. We're going to move on to number 6 and go on to Swedish forward Fabian Lysell. Now, Fabian Lysell has been rising quite a bit for me these past few months. I've been able to watch a lot more of him, not just in the SHL, but in the World Juniors. And even though it was a small sample size in the SHL, I think there was a lot of great productivity there that was translated to the World Juniors, and I thought he was Team Sweden's best overall consistent forward. When Sweden wasn't even playing that well, Fabian Lysell was still an absolute force, trying to make things happen and using that great silky smooth skill to try to do anything possible. I think Lysell will be a top 6 forward, and the potential, I think, he's actually pretty underrated too. But officially getting us inside the top 5, and at number 5, my 5th best prospect in the 2021 NHL draft. Even though he has been injured and unfortunately missed the U18s for Team USA, I still see him as one of the best defensemen and one of the best players in this draft. We're now going to move on to the 3rd Hughes brother in Luke Hughes. Now, Luke Hughes, for namesake, obviously has a lot of hype to his name, but a lot of it is absolutely justified. I could totally see a world where he not just becomes the best defenseman, but the best player in this draft. He's one of the youngest in this draft as well, and had an amazing USDP campaign where I thought, especially in the first half, was brilliant. And even in the second half, had some really good stretches of great overall puck handling, great skating, great defensive play that I thought was definitely a big improvement. Now, I think he would have maybe saved that USA team because they were definitely missing him on that defense, and I think he would have been absolutely fantastic. But now moving on to number 4, we're going to go to a guy that dropped a little bit for me, had interesting U18s in Brandt Clarke. Now, Brandt Clarke, I thought started off amazing in the U18s, was really a great force for Team Canada, was not just racking up points, but was racking up opportunities and getting the most of it. But in the second half, especially as competition got a little bit more steeper, I thought Brandt Clarke's pace of play was just a little bit off. Maybe not terrible, not bad, but not as impactful as I think it should have been. I still think Brandt Clarke had a decent U18s, but nothing that absolutely expanded upon what I saw in the pro game back in Slovakia. I think Brandt Clarke is still a great defenseman and a great quality prospect, but a guy that I'm not sure I would draft in the top 3 this year. But getting inside that top 3 and moving on at number 3, we're going to continue the Swedish force and the Swedish players at number 3 and go on to William Eklund. William Eklund is just a great prospect in my opinion, and there's not that much boom or bust factors to me. I think he will make the NHL. It's just a question of how high he will get in the lineup, and I think he will get very high in the lineup. I see him as a first line, great forward in the future, and even though he has played center in the past, I think forward and the wing is definitely what suits him the most. When it comes to Eklund, though, that tenacity, that overall play driving is one of the best in this draft. And I think that shot, that playmaking, that overall IQ also combines to a great overall toolbox that a lot of NHL teams would love to have. But once again, we find ourselves in the top two between the two Michigan products in Matthew Beniers and Owen Power. And still, I go back between these two guys a lot as my top two. But as you guys have seen throughout this channel in the past year, I think it's been an interesting case. I mean, again, Owen Power for a lot of people is number one, the consensus number one pick. And I think Owen Power, in some ways, could maybe deserve to get that. But in my opinion, he will come in at number two. To me, Owen Power is just a good prospect that has some glaring issues when it comes to just defensive consistency and intensity, especially at his size. I think there should be a lot more physical game to him that I think could be unlocked in the NHL in the future, but he has the size, he has the good overall offensive IQ that I think can become a good NHL player. It's just how good the NHL team that drafts him develops him as, and he'll likely be in the NHL in his first year, which I think might be a little bit of a mistake. I would give patience to Owen Power, and I think eventually he could become a top 4 and top 2 D-man that he has been hyped up to be. But we're going to move on to number 1 officially, go on to the best prospect, in my opinion, in the 2021 NHL draft, and move on once again to my boy in Matty Beniers. Matty Beniers is still number 1 in my opinion, even though there's not a huge gap between him and Owen Power for me. I still have Beniers at number 1 for a lot of different reasons. In terms of the most valuable positions, he is a number 1 center, and I think will be at the NHL level. Now, there's really no other centers that are completely going to be centers, in my opinion, in that top 20. Guys like McTavish, I think, could be center. Guys like Sillinger could be center, but it's a lot of maybes, and Räty, I would say, would be the only exception of that top 20, but Matt Beniers is the only one at that high-end level. When it comes to his two-way game, he's one of the best forecheckers, one of the best playmakers, one of the best play drivers, one of the most consistent players, one of the most mature players, one of the most clutch players out there. You saw in the U20s for Team USA how good he was in face-offs, how mature he was against U20 competition. There's so much I can talk about when it comes to Beniers, and there's really, in my opinion, no hole to his game. He's one of the most consistent, one of the best overall players, and in my opinion, the most NHL-ready player in this draft class. But that'll be it for today, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's mock draft, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell if you haven't already. Make sure you comment down below what you agree and disagree with my top 25 picks, and who do you see as the best prospects in the 2021 NHL draft. Let me know all your thoughts. Make sure you share this video with your friends, get the official mock drafts out there, and click on this card as well for all my hockey prospect content right on one playlist. My name is Nathan. Thanks so much for watching. Happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. You guys are absolutely amazing. And I'll see you in the next video or stream. All you beauties, have a great day. And goodbye.